It won't surprise you that I can talk about this topic at the drop of a hat for an hour. We don't have an hour. My purpose is to say a few things and then invite us to to enter into conversation with all of us. The difficulty of talking about diasporas, as with many other topics, is that there isn't one diaspora or two. Most scholars of diaspora recognize at least 35 populations as now officially being called diasporas. And if you listen to everybody, that is, to social scientists who study diasporas, to community leaders who say we are a diaspora when it suits them, to homelands which say we have a diaspora that no one recognizes. For example, the Egyptian government has started claiming that the Copts, the Coptic Christians who have left Egypt over time, in part because of persecution, are a specific Egyptian diaspora. And this claim comes from Egypt, trying to claim or reclaim or draw in a diaspora. So how many diasporas there are is both definitional and situational. Some people say that the Gypsies, or the Roma as they're called, are the world's only diaspora which has no notion of a homeland, but they are a diaspora. Why? One, they're dispersed all over the place. Two, at least their leadership identifies themselves as being part of a community, and they insist on keeping their distinct separate identity, but they have no homeland. So at the one end you have a diaspora arguable like the Gypsies, all the way to, say, the Jewish diaspora, the first and most paradigmatic. It's very difficult to put these under one umbrella, and I'm not going to try. I will say that much depends on who wants to know what and to do what with an idea. Diaspora is both a phenomenon. There really is a social phenomenon in certain places which can be safely identified as a diaspora, but it's also an idea. It's a concept. And ideas do work. That is, people grab onto an idea because they can do a certain kind of work with it that they couldn't do with another idea. And I wanted to say a few things which will seem disjointed from each other about how the journal came about and how it connects to the things we're talking about today. The journal came about, I don't know if Girard will remember this, we were all in the Zoyan Institute, and I forget, but I think it was early 1989, a friend of the Zoyan Institute who taught at Queen's College, Harac, I don't even remember Harac's last name. Zadoyan, thank you, a Romanian Armenian by origin, a political scientist, called us up and said, you know, the Jewish students here were organizing a get-together about the Jewish diaspora. The Greek students, there are a lot of Greeks in Queens. Astoria is in Queens. It's estimated that there may be 300,000 people of Greek origin just in Queens. They jumped in and they want to, and some of the Armenian kids want to also. We need people to come and talk. That's literally the beginning of diaspora as far as I'm concerned. And so we went. The Jewish community brought Abba Eban, the former foreign minister and a quite famous gentleman, and Amos Oz, a quite famous writer. The Greek community brought the person who was in charge of the bureau that was about to become the Hellenic Ministry of Diaspora. And the Armenian community brought Girard Libaridian and Khachik Sherarian, because basically there was, who speaks for the Armenian community? The first thing that got me to thinking about the journal Diaspora was simply a presence there. And you can say, if you are a skeptic, as someone as famous as Rogers Brubaker is, Rogers Brubaker asks the question, which was quoted here, who can have interest and agency? That is, who as a group can have interests and agency? And what kind of interest and agency? How subordinate are they to agendas set by others? At this point, when I was there, it was simply striking to me that people meaning student groups, wanted to be addressed as though they were members of a diaspora, most of them not having much of an idea what that was. But it was they who wanted to be addressed as such. We did not go and agitate and say, you know, you're a diaspora. So at a certain moment, certain ideas, certain labels, certain concepts acquire power in ways that are to some degree mysterious, although I've spent some 20 years writing and studying about this. The second thing that was happening at the time was that I had completely by accident, I was drinking coffee with a professor from my university in 1987, and she was a specialist in terrorism. And she had first worked on the Algerian insurgency against France and then had started working on terrorism. And she was telling me about what's called the Brigati Rossi, the Red Brigades in Italy, which were a terrorist organization, and about the Baader-Meinhof gang, which was a small terrorist cell in Germany. And after she was talking for a while, I said to this wonderful person, actually, somewhat rudely, oh, this is all wrong. You can't apply this to anything like Palestinian terrorism, which was known then. You can't apply it to Armenian terrorism, which had happened between 1975 and 1983 and had been much spoken about. She said, how come? And I started talking about it. She said, you know, that's interesting. Why I'm organizing a panel at APSA, the American Political Science Association. Why don't you come and give a talk about this? And I sort of started backing off, you know, APSA. And she said something that's very wise, and I will pass on to all of you. She said, Hachig, look, if you screw up, who's going to know? None of your colleagues will know. Only a bunch of political scientists. You don't mean anything to them. And if you don't screw up, who knows? Just literally like that. I said, you know, Khelkiskabargi, as we say in Armenian. I went and gave that talk. As I was writing and giving that talk, I realized that what I was talking about was a diasporic movement. Armenian terrorism doesn't come from Soviet Armenia. It comes from a particular set of diasporic conditions, not permanent conditions, conditions which changed in a certain way so that at a certain moment, a very small group of people suddenly acquired a certain form of what Brubaker would like to call agency and started acting in a way that had a certain kind of effect. Whether or not you respect that effect, you say, but it's terrorism, how can you even take it seriously? It had an effect. So it was at that time, between 87, when I wrote my first article, which was published in a political science journal about Armenian terrorism as a diasporic activity, and then the going to Queen's College. And I started thinking, you know, there's something here. And I was reading and listening. And the journal literally started when I wrote a proposal and sent it to Johns Hopkins and Oxford University Press. They both took it seriously. They both accepted it. And I came back to the Zorian Institute. And Girard said, Khelkis Gabargi. And there was someone else there who actually was willing to write some checks for it because you needed to finance the launching of a journal. That's how the journal was born. Now, interestingly enough, because the idea was what it was, Oxford University Press sent it out to 16 evaluators. All knew, as you know, an article will go to 1 or 2 referees. A book proposal will go to 2 or 3 referees. Journal proposals will go to between 5 and 8 referees normally. They sent it to 16 because they didn't quite know what to do with it. Susan Kaiser, the journal's acquisition person at Oxford University Press, not only shared these 16 letters with me, but she allowed me to know what I shouldn't have known, who wrote them. Eventually she told me who wrote them. Most of them were, this is a wonderful idea, this is an idea whose time had come. There was one that was quite negative. The person who wrote the negative was a friend, and he called me up. His name was Edward Said. He's a famous figure in many kinds of studies. And Edward said, don't you understand? First of all, we Palestinians can't afford to be recognized as a diaspora. We cannot afford to be recognized as we are not. And I said, well, what terms are we talking about? He said, we can be a menfa, which is something like an exile. We can be mahjar, which is a kind of migrant. And some people say we're a shatat, a dispersion in Armenian. The closest translation is tzronk, which is a word, tzronk, tzervadz, which we used to use in the old days, but we don't anymore. But he said we can't afford to be named as that because the homeland, we have to be exiles from the homeland. And if you know Said's work, you know that for him the term exile was a central term. He didn't want to shake up that idea. And then after ranting at me for a while, he said, and Achik, don't you understand? The Jews will take this journal over. That was the end of the conversation. I tell you these stories because the birth of a journal, it was born at a time which is very different from this. None of us knew that the Soviet Union, the first issue came out in May 1991. Who knew what was going to happen? Who knew how radically the relationship between the Armenian diaspora and the Armenian homeland was about to change? So things come about not because there is a absolutely certain discourse which logically generates the next step. It's because there are a certain set of ideas with which people talk about populations, ethnics, immigrants, guest workers, nations, and those situations are changing. So you have both the phenomena are changing and the ideas that are changing. And diaspora suddenly became a favorite idea within a few years. And we at the Zorian Institute at the time were fortunate to be able to cash in on that in a certain sense. I don't mean financially, but in ideological terms. We got hold of the idea. Since then, as I was thinking about in the flight over, I was thinking about what issues used to matter, and I thought I'd approach it this way. After the first year, Oxford University Press, which was publishing the journal, did an analysis of the first subscriptions that came in, not from universities, which are university libraries, but from individuals. Overwhelmingly, 2 kinds of people subscribed because you look at the university addresses. 1, anthropologists, to people who study literature from a post-colonial perspective. Okay. Now the anthropologists, because anthropology itself had been going through this wrenching change where instead of going somewhere 3,000 miles away where you studied a little population, they had started to study portions of the population of states as large as India and China who emigrated and went somewhere else. So the anthropologists actually followed them. Before, an anthropologist went to something like a tribe or a population living far away. Now anthropologists have been studying central, not metropolitan populations. Susan quoted Prina Verbner. Prina Verbner studies Pakistanis in London and Manchester, okay? She has been to Pakistan, she's done multi-local research, but her primary interest is the other. And it was very clear to a lot of people that the old notions in anthropology and elsewhere of a center and a periphery no longer hold. I know that a lot of people think in terms of a center and periphery, but one of the things that happened in the 90s is that we went from center and periphery to the notion of networks and nodes. The nodes of the net. So something that Sarah put up could be. Let's say that this is a network, and the network can have many nodes. This node would be more important than any other because more lines pass through it. But there's also no doubt that, and calling this the center would be. You could call this the center or not, but if you called it the center, you would have to be aware of the ideological decisions that you made to call it a center. Or you could call it a node. Each of them gives up something, it gains something, okay? There isn't such a thing as, of course it's the center, or of course it's just a node. It actually depends on decisions that you make. People don't understand how much of what's research and scholarship is driven not only by the facts of the case, but the kinds of questions that you want to ask and the kinds of issues that you want to consider. Let me just say a couple of other things very rapidly. In the development of diaspora studies, certain things emerge very rapidly as central. One is the question of identity, and already that's been mentioned. For example, Shushan talked about how memory and identity are linked in diasporas, and one would say also in homelands, actually. But in homelands, the memory is more officially formulated as a history. Another one was the question of mobility. Who moves, for what purposes, and with what consequences? And another one was, is the... this one? Okay.
We're very technological.
High-tech place here, yeah. Another one is if you ask me, where's my home? It's the United States. I've been living here since I immigrated here 40 plus years ago. If you ask me where's my homeland, I would say Armenia. But if you don't ask the question, it becomes confusing. And the first time I realized how generalized this problem had become was when two things coincided. I gave a talk in Watertown, Massachusetts, Armenian community. And a young man got up and said in English, but you know, I know that Armenia was the Hyrenik of my grandfather, but I'm an American. This is my home. And then he went on to talk about how both places mattered to him. I went to Poitiers in France to a very large international conference. There were several people from Israel who gave talks, and when the third of them gave a talk where Israel was constantly the homeland, a young woman in the audience who was an American sociologist got up and said, I'm an American, I'm a Jew, the United States is my home. Israel is the country that I care about most other than the United States. And the Armenian kid who had gotten up in Watertown had said, well, America is my home. Armenia is the other place that I want to be helpful to as much as I can. And it's this very strong change that divides generations of organizers, divides people from in the homeland, in the Armenian homeland, it's exactly. If you start thinking about identity and home, there are actually the vast majority of Armenians in America, their identity, their home is America, their identity is American Armenian, probably with that order. But they do recognize this homeland, many, many, many of them. And if you enable them to do something for it, they will if they're appropriately motivated and organized. This is true not just for us, but even for the paradigmatic community, Jews. I will give you an example in my teaching. I teach a course called Diaspora's Transnationalism and Globalization. The first day of one of the semesters, the class started, I said, why don't you tell me why you're here? Several students said what interested them, but most didn't speak. I was surprised, and I knew several of them. They'd taken courses with me before. So I turned to a woman student, a Jewish student, who had taken classes from me as a freshman, as a junior, and now was taking it as a senior. I knew her, I liked her, she liked me. I said, Alyssa, why aren't you saying anything about being Jewish? She thought about it for a second. And she said, well, Professor Tossounian, I know I'm Jewish. You know I'm Jewish. The problem is my mother and my grandmother also know that I'm Jewish, and they think they know what that means. They know what I must do, who I must date, who I must marry, what studies I should undertake, when I should go to synagogue. I said, let's face it, Professor Tossounian, I can't afford to be that Jewish. That's another notion of identity. We think of identity as something fixed, but for this kid at that place at that time, she couldn't afford to be that Jewish. And the notion of identity changes with circumstances. And one of the things diaspora studies does is to ask under what circumstances do people allow claims to be made on them from the homeland while they're at home elsewhere. To me, that it's one of the most fascinating things. And how much of themselves are they willing to lend to certain activities? And of course, of these activities, the one that nowadays tends to interest Armenians most is the relationship between the homeland and the diaspora. Well, there are many studies of homeland-diaspora relations. Most of you now who are younger don't remember that there once used to be a country called Taiwan, which was the only recognized China. It was headed by Chiang Kai-shek, and after that by the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. Most countries in the world, in the Western world, that recognized something, recognized Taiwan. Eventually, after 1972, Nixon, China, People's Republic of China, the PRC, became recognized. And there was a tremendous competition between Taiwan and the PRC and nationalists and the communists for who would get the loyalty of Chinese communities. The history of this struggle is not yet written. But if you think that Tashtak and Chagram Gavar was a big struggle, let me tell you. For one thing, the amount of capital that was at stake in the struggle, because the major Chinese communities were very wealthy. There was a tremendous struggle about who had their loyalty and the arguments that were laid out for that loyalty, both ideological arguments, communism as opposed to non-communism, the appeal to the United States, come on, you have to be on our side, Taiwan's side, because the other guys are the other side. But of course, the emotional appeal for the vast majority of Chinese was, Taiwan isn't the homeland. China is the homeland. 2,500 years of continuous written stories, the graves of our grandfathers, so forth and so on. And you have arguments that went from something close to blackmail, actually governments blackmailing people, all the way to ideological arguments we would easily understand. And to us, our own struggles, the changing level of enthusiasm in the diaspora about Armenia, and the changing levels of everything from expectation to hostility to condescension and condemnation that go on back and forth now between homeland governments, our homeland government, the diaspora's attacks on the homeland, and vice versa, which we disguise to some degree and which are quite fierce in my opinion. They seem extraordinary to us, but they're not. Every time a homeland has emerged strongly, like the PRC among the Chinese, there have been problems. The history of Israel and the Jews not only is not fully available, it is actually not allowed. Two of the people this is the journal Diaspora. Two of the people on the board, Yossi Shane was the chair of political science in Tel Aviv, and Gabi Sheffer, both of whom are old friends for me, teaches at Hebrew University until he just retired. A number of the documents that have to do with Ben-Gurion's conversations with his inner circle about what attitude to take about Jewish political organizations and financial organizations in diaspora are still considered too delicate to release, because they had to have a discussion. Do we try to establish Israeli-style Zionist political party and cells in the diaspora, or do we try to work with their existing structures, some of which had been very helpful in financial ways? Do we try to maintain the Zionist organizations in diaspora? Because from 1890s on, there was a very large network of, there's a whole struggle, Bundist, Zionists, so forth and so on. And they made the decision that it would be better to leave most of the organizations that existed in diaspora in place and to manipulate them ideologically and politically, okay? So there's this whole range of things. I don't want to go on and on about it. As I said, I could go on for us. But diaspora there are so many diasporas, there are so many disciplines from the perspective of which diasporas are studied, that an easy generalization, such as does diaspora mean exactly the same thing for each discipline, and can it be studied methodologically in the same way? No. What there is a phenomenon of the way in which people recognize themselves and organize themselves. There are a number of options available. Diaspora is one of them. Almost always, when ethnic communities, when a dispersion becomes a diaspora, or where an ethnic community also starts being recognized as a diaspora. In both of these cases, and here my friend Sarah and I differ, it is almost always a small elite, a small percentage of the population that announces the existence of a diaspora. I will end by telling you what my friend Wanima Lubiano, who is a black woman who teaches at Duke, said to me once. I've never forgotten this. She is a professor of literature, but very active in the African American community, and she teaches at Duke. So in North Carolina, as in much of the American South, there are a lot of black people who are very church-oriented. I don't know if you know this about people, African Americans in the South. They're church ladies auxiliaries, just like there are with Armenian churches. And she gets invited to come give talks, and she always accepts. She says, it's my duty to go. And she says the first time, she and I have known each other since before the creation of the journal. The first time she went to a group where she started talking about this, that, and the other, and the African diaspora, one of the very nicely dressed ladies said, excuse me, sister, what do you mean diaspora? She explained. There was sort of hushed silence. She didn't understand what was going on. She finished her talk. And she got these really angry black ladies. And they said, don't you know what you're doing? 350 years, we've been trying to get white Americans to accept us as Americans. The moment since 1964 we've started being accepted as Americans. Now you want to tell them we're Africans? We're not African Americans. We don't care what Jesse Jackson says. We don't care what, etc. We're Americans. We don't like this word at all. It creates a division. It scared them. It really angered them. She just absolutely not expected it because she comes from the elite academy where it is very much the case that people speak of an African American diaspora. Okay? So it's not just, does the term apply? For example, the term African American diaspora is used. 90% of African Americans don't know what that means, and if they're told, they don't want to be one. Be very clear. 99.9% of American Jews know what the term means and accept that they're part of a diaspora, although like my student, they might say, I can't afford to be that Jewish. But they understand what it means, where it comes from, so forth and so on. So, you know, one of the questions it raises is, does a group exist as an African American diaspora where 90% of the people in it don't want to be in it or don't know what it is? What does it mean to say, nevertheless, it exists? All the way to the other level of mobilization and identity. I'll stop there just because I think it would be much better to have some time to talk to each other. Thank you.
Given your time of departure at 7.
I can 7:15.
Well, I don't know. When is the cab coming?
Is the cab coming at 7? Okay then.
Okay.
So what do you suggest?
15 minutes.
Okay.
Question.
Sure. I'll be happy to call on people if there are
If you have a
questions
question,
or
please
comments.
get to the microphone for
The comment's
recording.
not too long, of course, but anyone want to say anything? To any one of, you might address the question to a specific speaker, or you might address it to any one of us.
You can begin by giving a little bit of time, a couple of minutes to comment on your comment.
Sure.
We could do either way.
We've talked a long time. If there's anybody who wants to
Yeah. Ron.
Thank you very much, all of you, for a very interesting thing. I always say this to my students, but I'm going to say it today again. I have always been confused about diaspora, but after this panel, I'm confused at a higher level, and thank you for that. It's true, because I have more questions than I have answers. I still don't quite, and this is to everybody, and I'd love you to sort of think, tell me what you think about this. First of all, the relationship of diaspora, rather than exile, immigrant, whatever, to the homeland. Is that essential? Khachik mentioned the anomalous case, you know, the exception that might prove the rule of the Roma, of the Gypsies. Who knows what they where they think their homeland is or what it was. But that set aside, can there be a diaspora community that doesn't have some sense, as Susan put it, of imagined homeland. And when I wrote the one piece I ever wrote on that, that was what I came up with as well. That seemed sensible. And along with what Hachik's remarks, this is to both Sarah and to Lucila. Let me see if I can say this right. Is there a sense of those who most might want to be Americans or Argentinians, more recent emigres perhaps, emigres from Soviet or post-Soviet Armenia to LA or to Buenos Aires, who would reject or be indifferent to this sense of diaspora, whereas the earlier, well-established, already Argentinian, already American Armenians can enjoy, exploit, and celebrate the notion of diaspora, right? And the final question, this might be mostly to Susan, sorry about all this, but this is what you raised in my mind. Armenians, if you live in Armenia, if you're from Armenia, and I asked this question to Flora Bardakjian once, it was unproblematic what it was to be Armenian. You're Armenian. You know, you're born in Armenia, but it's about blood, basically. I've never heard anyone say, I'm half Russian. I live and work with Russians. I never heard anyone say, I'm half Russian. But all the time you hear Armenians say, I'm half Armenian, I'm a quarter Armenian. And does that show some kind of insecurity about nationality? Policing of borders or who's allowed in or out? Or is it because we still have, at some fundamental level, some notion of ethnicity as genetic? Those are my questions.
Who wants to start answering from our side here? Is it the microphone there? And it's being taped, so you should use a microphone.
All right. So we'll go backwards. Well, all three of us are half Armenians. Turn it on. Hello? Is that working?
If there are numbers.
Oh, the numbers are coming up.
Is that okay? Yeah, okay, so all three of us are half Armenian. Where do we go from there? I think it's frankly a function of course it's genetic. I mean, you know, people ask, are you Armenian? You know, is it your mother or your father? Those are your genes. So that's where that comes from. It's not a matter of racial identity or something like that, but rather than how do you call yourself. Now, it depends on, as somebody said earlier, where I am as to how I describe myself. I grew up thinking I was Armenian. My father thought of himself as an honorary Armenian. It was only when I went out and did my fieldwork, people kept saying, you know, like, so, you know, like, what are you then? You know, you're not apostolic. Your name's not Armenian. You don't speak the language at that time. I didn't speak. So, you know. And then you become half Armenian. It's the way you describe yourself is a function of everybody around you and how they, as Lucila described quite eloquently, I think, your reaction to what your audience, with whom you're speaking, and how they are framing who you are, as well as who you think you are. But speaking for myself, it's never come from an angle of insecurity. No, it's just a description. And as Hachik said earlier, I mean, certainly I'm American. I'm not half American, but I'm completely American.
You're half American. You couldn't say that.
No, actually you couldn't, because we'd have to cut your passport in half or something like that. So I don't really think of myself, I think, as half and half. I think of myself as fully both.
You guys are half Armenian. Also. But you have other questions to answer?
Oh, yeah. Regarding the use of diaspora and the comparison between more recent immigrants and diasporic Armenians, in Argentina at least, what I found out so far is that diaspora itself, it's becoming a category of practice of differentiation between Armenians, I mean newcomers, and the ones that were settled at the beginnings of the 20th century, and is used by the newcomers, Armenians from Armenia, as a way of differentiation in speech, I mean, in their discourse. It's like, I'm Armenian from Armenia. I am not diasporic. They don't use diasporic, of course. They say I'm not part of the diaspora. So in my case of study, I am also differentiating the social categories that natives use to refer to themselves in terms of belonging, in terms of their identity, and the concept of diaspora we use, if we use it as an analytical tool as researchers. I don't know if so.
Briefly, I would say that indeed, Armenians from Armenia in Los Angeles, I rarely heard any hesitancy saying I am part of the Armenian diaspora. Actually, as Lucila just said, it's more category to designate the others, meaning the older immigrants. But here, I think, for me, that's why diaspora can be used and can be also an analytical category. It is a claim. And that's why we need to contextualize and really study when did this claim rise. And in the case of the Armenian diaspora, as everybody probably knows here, the word Spurk was used for the first time in the 20s in Jerusalem in a journal called Sion, or Zion, and by the Patriarch of Jerusalem. And so we need to understand why at one point a group would decide to define itself as a diaspora. And as Hachikrodan mentioned earlier, in the case of the African American, scholars designated the group as diaspora, not the people themselves. So why? And I believe in what the question we can ask is, in what interests? Why is it for some people an advantage to claim to be part of a diaspora? And actually, for the Armenians from Armenia, going back to your question, the interest of saying I'm part of the diaspora is not, maybe the interest is not important, or it becomes important when you need a position among the older immigrants. You say, I'll belong to the diaspora to get a job, to, So the question is, when is this word used, by whom, and for what interest? And I believe the power relations among the groups are very strong, and diaspora is a very powerful category. When you say, I'm part of a diaspora, it means implicitly, my group is better organized. We have a greater politicization among our groups. We are better, it's almost becoming a moral category. Mm-hmm. We are better than immigrants. We do better. We are a more historical group. And it's also when it becomes scary, because by becoming moral, you also exclude others, and you say, I'm better than, others. So that's the type of question I try to address in my work.
It's certainly true that calling yourself a member of a diaspora in a variety of communities means you're more mobilized. You're mobilized culturally, maybe mobilized economically and politically, but of course that also means that you're accepting a different burden. All immigrants from Armenia or from many other countries, they accept a responsibility in terms of, for example, sending money to kinship groups in the homeland. It's practically universal. We know how much money goes. From the United States, enough money goes to the Philippines every year to pay all of the foreign debt of the Philippines, interest and for that year. That's what they do. They actually, those nurses and servants of the Philippine extraction, that's what they do. But they don't do it by saying they're a diaspora. The vast majority of them think they just owe it to their families and they send the money back. But in fact, their leaders say, we're the Philippine diaspora. And when Ferdinand Marcos starts becoming a real problem, suddenly their elite emerges and starts appealing to the government in Washington to do something about Ferdinand Marcos. And then they disappear again. I mean, you can actually watch, if you watch just one diaspora, as we'll call it, of the Philippines, you can see when they mobilize on some basis, then when they sort of sink back again to being extended network family groups that help each other. So diaspora is not a term that describes something static, but depending on opportunity structures, as some people like to say, and interest is mobilized more or less. Ara?
But there's a different, no concrete analysis has been done on this, I'm sure. But my observations by watching Armenian state television, especially in the summers when I'm in Beirut, the use of the word diaspora there is now having a very, very different notion from what we are talking about here. When an Armenian television presenter uses the word spurk for Los Angeles, it basically understands the people who have gone from Armenia. When all these singers go and say, we went and sang before Spurk, they didn't go in front of Bolsahais and Beirutsis and others. The Alex Theater or the other things were filled in fully by, Hayastansis, who probably nowadays have dual citizenship as well. When you look at diaspora ministry reports, only the last week, we sent so many tens of thousands of textbooks to the diaspora. Right. And I said, well, which countries? Well, Ukraine and etc. So it's really changing. I heard this, I cannot confirm, but in a very recent Tashnag organized conference in Beirut, a former member of the Armenian government, who resigned because when the party went out, supposedly said that you are not the diaspora are those who have gone from Armenia in the last 10 years. I doubt whether this was actually what's said, but that was the impression of how many people were upset about how they were being treated. So while we're saying no, Armenian Hayastansis don't consider themselves to be diaspora in Los Angeles, I don't know. If you go on and look at how the frame is being used in Armenia, it's being used in a very different context.
I think that's a good point, and that illustrates the way that diaspora and homeland are changing. And I think at the moment we have sort of parallel homelands and diasporas, and there's a very real effort by Armenia to recreate, or to change the rest of the diaspora, the old diaspora, into a periphery of the center. And so we've got this transitional period right now where we've got sort of two kinds of diasporas going. And perhaps eventually they will succeed, and there will be one kind of diaspora that has a center and a periphery. But at the moment, it's much more chaotic. It's more or less like Sarah's e-web map, whatever that was there. I think that's a pretty good description.
There really are. The players in the notion of diaspora are the population themselves and how they divide themselves. They're both the elites in the local communities of the diaspora and in the homeland, in the chief node. They're social scientists who actually don't take their cues necessarily from the population. You mustn't forget artists of various sorts. I have a little poster, which is a Haitian song in which a Haitian band thinks about the Creole diaspora. So in Haiti, the term is so accepted by the people that the Haitian diaspora in the United States is called the 10e département. Haiti is divided into 9 departments, and the 10e is over in the United States. Haitians, very interestingly, have become very important to both notions of diaspora and transnationalism. Some of the most important studies of transnationalism, those of us who work at it know, originated with Haiti. And I have never read something comparative and good about why certain populations eagerly adopt this self-appellation, while others either reject it or say, well, yeah, we're ethnics. I often use the example of the Cubans. If you talk to the Cubans in Miami and New Jersey, there's always a small group that say, we're exiles. The moment Castro dies, we're going back. Exile means we're only here for a time. We're going to return. There are some who consider themselves nearly assimilated. Of course, I'm proud of my Hispanic ancestry, but I'm an American of Cuban ancestry, and there's the large group in the middle which think of themselves as Cuban ethnics, of which maybe 10% think of themselves as diasporic. All of the terms are circulating in the community at the same time with different levels of popularity. Okay, working on diaspora is never just, well, I'll separate everything else out and I'll only think about diaspora. Working on diaspora means working on ethnicity, on national claims, on transnationalism, on globalization. It's not like there's just this and nothing else, but it is a term which is a player in the world of concepts, the conceptual vocabulary by which we think of people outside the homeland. And I don't think as such it's going to go away, whatever Rogers Brubaker says.
One very quick comment. That is, in all of this, we're missing an important dimension, that is with regard to the homeland. For those diasporas or dispersions that are from big countries, where the absence of the group, the dispersion of the group doesn't matter, in terms of the survival of the state. And there are no major concerns. Italians, French, Chinese, Indians.
Sure.
You know, the diaspora, the concept of diaspora must be very different than compared to Jews, Armenians, who have concepts of homeland that are endangered. Small, surrounded with enemies. The dynamism that comes to the linkage of the two units, homeland, is very different, and that is a distinguishing factor, I think, in terms of why do you need to help?
It is, Gerard, but at the same time, whereas for Armenia, say, the diaspora, the creation of a new diaspora of Armenians from Armenia is a net loss to the nation in some ways, and we're going to start thinking about what net advantages there are. Take the Indians. There are about 950 million Indians in the world. About 38 million of them are in diaspora. Indian government is the most organized effort to draw the diasporas back. They have categories: persons of Indian origin, non-resident Indians. Special laws are passed. They're trying to bring those people back in, not because they couldn't do without them, as you said, 950 million people, they don't, but because they think that in every level, from the financial to the cultural, they have something, they stand to profit. So whether your interest is, you use the word interest, your interest is survival or profit as a homeland, you can still be interested. I mean, none of us spoke. I don't feel ready to speak about Hranush Hagopian and the Ministry of Diaspora. I just read things, but I don't at all feel ready. Does someone here know enough to say something?
I don't think we should get into that for a number of reasons. Maybe we should
discontinue. Okay. Thank you very much, all of you.